I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Amber Holmes. Amber is a registered early childhood educator of mixed Anishinaabe and European descent. She's been serving the early childhood educator community in the county of Wellington and in the region of Waterloo for many years. She's been facilitating workshops, leading professional networks and communities of practice, as well as providing mentoring services and coordinating early learning conferences. Amber is the co-founder and facilitator of the Indigenous Learning Circle Guelph, which supports local schools, churches, libraries, not-for-profit organizations, and community agencies in decolonizing practices to better support Indigenous children, families, and communities. So I'd like to turn it over to Amber. Welcome, Amber, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks very much. Can everybody see me and hear me? Yeah? Everybody can see me and hear me? Yay, okay. Yeah, so I'm Amber Holmes, and I enjoy doing this, connecting with educators, talking about reflective practices and how do we serve children in the best way possible. And so this idea of our identity keeps coming back to me as being something that needs to be talked about more, because how we identify ourselves and how we interact with children is based so much on our identity, and sometimes we don't realize how our identity might impact the identity of others. So there it is. Okay. So I do want to touch on our responsibility to children as it's outlined in our Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice, and then get into this idea of Indigenous identity and the kinds of things that tend to impact on it. So as it says, Standard 2, our responsibility is to respond to the uniqueness of individuals and groups of children. They identify appropriate strategies, access the necessary resource, and design curriculum to ensure full participation of all children, taking into accountability cultural and linguistic diversity and Indigenous identity. This piece about cultural and linguistic identity, it's so wrapped in some colonial practices that can have almost devastating impacts on children. And so I'm going to use some examples throughout this presentation to explain how, in the context of colonialism, children can be impacted negatively in programs just through the ways that we celebrate or the ways that we offer any kind of learning in the classroom. If we're not acutely aware of some of the histories, we can be negatively impacting children's identity. Exactly what I said, getting a little ahead of myself on the slides. I think part of the issue is that for so many years, we, in public education and in higher education, we didn't necessarily hear or we weren't necessarily taught about Canada's true history. We talk about these issues that we don't necessarily know the root of, and that can be problematic. So we're gonna take a little bit of time to unpack some of the things that have happened in the last 150 years to give us context to this conversation. So I want to give an example of starting with 150 years ago. And of course, colonial impacts started well beyond that. We're talking 500 years since European settlers first started landing here on Turtle Island. But 150 years ago is when we saw things like the residential schools being written into law. Part of our legislation was to send Indigenous children to these boarding schools so that they would lose their connection with their culture and their traditions and their languages. And so it was pointed out, somebody had sent me an email from the last seminar that I did, reminding me that this is a really good example, because we have many Canadians celebrate Canada Day as being a day to rejoice, and it's about patriotism, and what isn't really talked about, and what for some Indigenous people it's actually a horrifying day, because it's celebrating the Indian Act being written into legislation, Indigenous peoples being placed on reserve, so taken from their traditional lands and put on small plots of lands. This all started 150 years ago, and so last year, when we spent millions celebrating Canada Day, for a lot of Indigenous people, it was not a day of celebration; it was a day of mourning. So if you're having these programs where you're talking about Canada Day, and it's all sort of painted with this patriotic celebratory sort of sense, if there are Indigenous children in that program, we saw these things being passed into law as an attempt to get rid of the quote-unquote Indian problem in the country. So to celebrate this in classrooms might be a way of showing the children in your program that there is a huge divide between your understandings and your values because you celebrate something that for them is a day of mourning. I wanted to give another example of something that happens a lot in early childhood programs, where we would see educators and children singing "Old MacDonald Had a Farm." Now, I didn't really realize for the longest time what issue there could be with that, but if you think of it in the terms of European settlers actually having brought over horses, pigs, chickens, sheep, and cows, that there weren't farms on Turtle Island or North America before European settlers arrived. So when you're singing about Old MacDonald Had a Farm, you're singing about something that impacts Indigenous people who, were taken off their traditional lands to make room for farmland, and singing about animals that have no cultural context. They're not relatable to a lot of Indigenous people because they're not part of the teachings, they're not part of our histories, they're not part of our ceremonies. So even just something as simple as singing "Old MacDonald Had a Farm" could alienate some children and impact their identity. So I wanted to take this moment to ask another poll question. And that's whether or not you feel you have a deep understanding of how colonial practices impact Indigenous identity. And I know I've only just given two small examples, celebrating Canada Day and singing "Old MacDonald Had a Farm," but in terms of your overall understanding of how colonial practices might impact Indigenous identity in this country. We'll just take a couple minutes. Okay, so you see about half of the participants have answered at this point, and it's somewhat what I expected. A lot of no's and not reallys, and I think that's a very positive thing, because if we knew everything there was to know about how to support Indigenous identity, you probably wouldn't be here listening to me. So this is something, and there's no easy answer to this piece, because the aspect around Indigenous identity also includes the fact that there are so many differences between different Indigenous cultural groups and languages and traditions and things like that. So it's not necessarily easy to pin down, because everybody's experience is different. So in order to really dive deep, you have to really focus on those individual relationships. And I'll go into that a little bit more later on in the session. So I know for some people, they were hoping to be able to come to this place and hear something that is going to give them answers as to things that they can do in their program to support children. So the important thing to understand is that you have to start at a place of your own individual identity before you can move into supporting the identity of others. So this idea of respectfully exploring Indigenous pedagogies really requires a fundamental understanding of the differences in worldviews between the different nations, the Eurocentric worldview versus Indigenous worldviews, and the fact that we have different ways of learning and knowing. And that, for some people, can be really hard to consolidate, because we are familiar with very didactic ways of learning, right? Whereas in a lot of Indigenous cultures, learning happens in many different ways and always through relationship with our elders, with our teachers, with our family, with the land, with the elements, with plants and animals, that we see all of, and I say we as in my Anishinaabe background, this is how we see learning as being very holistic. And I also want to mention that my teachings are going to be different from somebody else's teachings, that there's such diversity in Indigenous communities that even another Anishinaabe educator would probably have different teachings from me, because we didn't grow up in the same family. So that's also something that you need to keep in mind when you're wanting to support the children in your own programs, is that you can't go and find information online or from these various sources that's going to support them, because you don't know their cultural or linguistic or spiritual or their personal background in that way. So one thing I think it really helps to illustrate is some of the differences between Indigenous worldviews and more Eurocentric views. So when we talk about ways that you can be supporting children and families in your programs, you can begin from this understanding that you might see the world differently than they do. So a Eurocentric view, an example of a Eurocentric view is to compartmentalize things, right? And we sometimes see this in our social services, right, where we have these silos that exist where, you know, this team is responsible for this, and you go across town and this team is responsible for this, and there's not a lot of connection between them. In Indigenous communities, in a lot of Indigenous views, everything is connected. So you wouldn't necessarily have a doctor who's just looking at your physical health. You would be having a holistic view of your well-being. Your physical, your mental, your emotional, and your spiritual health is all taken into consideration all the time. And the same thing goes with families. You can't have one family member who's unwell without that impacting other family members. So you have to have a very holistic view of how health impacts everyone involved, right? Another example of this difference in the Eurocentric and Indigenous views is our relationship with land and natural resources. So often we see the Eurocentric view as being that the land is here for our use, for us to extract whatever we need from it, often to the point of depletion. Whereas in my teachings and in many Indigenous views, we human beings, we're dependent on the land, we need it for our survival, and therefore it's our responsibility to make sure it's taken care of. so much so that my ancestors, the Anishinaabe, who were nomadic, they were nomadic because they would live in a place only so long as it didn't deplete the natural resources. When those natural resources started to become depleted, they would move on so as to not destroy beyond repair their use of the land. So we see this too, I think, in the way we look at professional development as being something that we can, as educators, we can find a source of information, we can get that information, synthesize it, and then use it. That's a sort of a consumerist view on knowledge, whereas in my teachings, the whole premise is that if you're going to learn something, you're going to learn that through relationship. We're oral culture. The Anishinaabe have only been using the written words as long as the European settlers have taught them that. So prior to that, everything was spoken. And so all of your teachings you would receive from somebody you knew, or you would receive teachings from, like I said, the land, the water, the fire, the air, plants, medicines, animals, insects, everything. Everything is a teacher if you're in need of learning. And that our role is actually to create and exist within a reciprocal relationship. So again, we have this sort of top-down Eurocentric view of the world and its responsibility to us as humans, that we have a right to take and consume because that's what we want, versus this Indigenous view of life actually, the meaning of life is to create and to reciprocate, so that we're never taking more than we need, and we're never taking more than anyone or anything can give. Oh, so here's an example, and I love telling this little story to my coworkers and colleagues and people that I run into, because it's one of those little things that unless you know, you don't know. So I think one thing a lot of us can identify is the snack time scenario, where you are sitting down to the table with children to have snack, and there are strawberries, they're in a bowl, they're, cut up, and the greens have been cut off. Usually these strawberries come from a store. They might even be shipped into Canada from either the US or Mexico. And they're usually pretty big and uniform. This is what we usually see from the grocery stores. Now, for Indigenous children who have grown up with teachings about strawberries, and I'll just share my teaching about strawberries that I received. It's that the strawberry is known as the Heartberry. It's the first berry of the year. It grows wild, and if you've ever seen wild berries, they're not huge, they're not uniform. They're very juicy. They have a very different taste from the ones that you would get at the grocery store. And they're called the Heartberry for a number of reasons. There are teachings about how the Heartberry came into existence, but one of the reasons it's called the Heartberry is because it has health benefits. It's good for your heart, lowers blood pressure, and the greens, which a lot of Anishinaabe and other Indigenous groups would actually eat the greens because it has also medicinal benefits, like eases digestion, things like that. So imagine being an Indigenous child who has these teachings about the Heartberry and knows what a Heartberry looks like and knows what a Heartberry tastes like and knows that you always eat the greens. And then you go into a childcare center and there are these massive, pale, sliced open, by comparison, sometimes flavorless, strawberries with the greens cut off. And how does that make you feel when you have so much value for the Heartberry that there are stories about it and you celebrate with Heartberry, and when you go into this environment that's supposed to be welcoming and make you feel like you belong, you may be the only child there who knows there's something wrong with these strawberries. And nobody else seems to notice. Nobody else seems to have any issue with them. I really like this visual. This came from the Canadian Council on Learning, and it just illustrates how a lot of First Nations kind of view lifelong learning. I'm a visual person, so I liked the idea of having this tree that shows our relationship, that shows that learning comes from, you know, our clans, our languages, our community, our family, our ancestors, the natural world, that all of these things feed our collective well-being. So what happens when you're removed from your territorial land, your traditional lands, the language is removed from your family because you've attended residential school. You don't have your connection with the ancestors because you're no longer on the land and holding ceremony. Your community might be scattered, your clan might be scattered, and then also there's the loss of elders. There's all kinds of things that happened when Indigenous peoples were put on reserves and disconnected from their traditional hunting and fishing lands and ceremonial lands and things like that. So we look at this model from the perspective of somebody who has been removed from their home and how that impacts their ability to learn for the rest of their life. And it's not just what happened 150 years ago, but there are these ongoing colonial influences that still impact Indigenous people today. And something like celebrating Canada's 150th anniversary, for so many Indigenous people, that was the biggest day of mourning. I remember feeling that I couldn't believe how much was going into this celebration when it was a celebration of colonialism, and basically it was a celebration of genocide. And that this genocide, these genocidal practices actually continue to this day. So when you're thinking about your identity, and a lot of people, when they start to come to these realizations about their country and their country's history, they go through this almost identity crisis. And that's the settler identity, the settler guilt. It's a very real thing. And people are often, I know from my own perspective, that you get to this point of feeling bad and wanting to push that away, right? Wanting to do something to fix it. The problem with that is you're not taking your time in that discomfort to truly understand why you're uncomfortable, why this isn't okay. That takes a lot of deep thought and reflection. And it's not until you get to that place of understanding why this bothers you so much, and what it is about your privilege that is making you feel like you need to do something. For anybody who has safe drinking water coming out of the taps of their homes, that right there shows that you have a privilege that a lot of Canadians don't have, and those Canadians are living on reserves. So it really it's a long process of unpacking these feelings about our own identity, but that really needs to be the first start when you're looking to incorporate Indigenous pedagogies in your programs. So right on cue here, how do we bring Indigenous perspective to curriculum? I want to say the biggest thing you can do is focus on your relationships. Focusing on the relationships with the children in your program and their families. Focus on relationships between you and the Indigenous leaders and elders in your community. And if you don't know of any, or you don't have any, or you just don't know where to start, think about where the children in your program may be coming from, and have a conversation with the families. They can often point you in the direction of, we have these elders, or there are these services, and these are people that you can talk to. But the urge to go online and get your answers is, again, kind of glossing over that uncomfortable feeling of guilt or needing to do something to fix it, when really that could potentially alienate some children. So here's an example. So in my teachings in the Anishinaabe, when we hold ceremony, we go clockwise in the circle. But some Haudenosaunee go counterclockwise. Now, that's a very basic example, but if you were to, say, find out that you had a child in your program who was Anishinaabe and said, well, you know, today we're going to hold circle, but we're going to do it counterclockwise because I read online that when Indigenous people hold ceremony, they go counterclockwise, just as an example. But that might be alienating to the child, and it also might send a message to that child that their teachings are wrong. And we certainly don't want children to feel that their culture or their history isn't correct. And it's almost impossible to know what teachings anyone has received without having a conversation with them, without getting to know them on a deeper level, without truly knowing where they come from. And that can be very hard to do, and it's not easy when you just want to learn so much and you don't know where to start. So again, I'm going to reiterate, you know, develop relationships with people on your local reserve. Develop relationships with people who work in agencies who have Indigenous populations as a focus, right? Getting those understandings, getting those learnings from individuals, from real people versus something that you found online, which may or may not be valid or relevant, or you know, I'm just going to say it, sometimes you find stuff online that's purely made up. So in light of that, and knowing that relationships are so important as you go on this journey, try to resist the urge to consume culture in order to replicate it in your classroom. Instead, focus on that relationship, that reciprocity, and the idea of creation, that creating spaces for children and families to connect about their culture is so much more valuable than just pulling culture, just pulling it out of the air or off the internet or out of a book somewhere. Those relationships are going to lead you to the learning that you need to have. So yeah, I can't really give any other suggestions as to how to bring Indigenous curriculum or pedagogies into your curriculum, other than to say that when I think about what it means to involve my children in my culture, I take them outside and we spend time on the land. We spend time with nature. We spend time exploring the elements. I think it's universal that all children love water. But not to say that, you know, we're going to go do this because it's what the Indigenous people do. It's to help children create or develop that ecological identity. Because when I think about the differences in these worldviews, ecological identity in my culture, that starts so early. And we have this tendency to not spend as much time outside now. We've got all this great technology and things that keep us indoors and busy. But it's about slowing down and really developing relationships with grass and trees and sun and water and all of those things that are going to teach children how to take care of our earth so that we're giving back instead of taking. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how does learning happen, in as much as I find that this is a great resource for asking some of those questions and guiding some of those relationship building directives where you really want to focus on supporting the children and their families. How Does Learning Happen has great reflective questions. It's one of those tools that you can use over and over and over again. It's not, you know, I read it once and put it on a shelf. It's, you know, how can I use this tool to help frame the conversations, the relationships, and the pedagogies that I want to pursue. So by all means, if you don't already have a copy, you can get them online. Service Ontario, I think, has them for free, or you can download the PDF. It's really easy to get a copy of it. But if you're looking for a resource that can support this relationship building and your exploration of these relationships, I really recommend How Does Learning Happen. All right, so we're going to open up the last 24 minutes to questions.
Okay, so this is Melinda from the college. Thank you so much, Amber, for that incredible presentation. It was really insightful and really provided lots of food for thought. I would like to, as Amber said, open it up for questions. So please feel free to ask Amber anything within the chat box feature. We can direct those questions to her. And just a reminder, if you do have questions broadly about the college, the CPL program, the registration or renewal process, please do check us out on the website or contact our departments directly about that information. And we'll be happy to connect with you about those things at another time. Okay, so we'll just take a few moments. If it looks like multiple attendees are typing, so I'll just give it a few moments for those questions to come in. But you know what, Amber, maybe I'll start us off. As you were sharing your information tonight, as you were telling the Heartberry story and the strawberry story, as well as sort of sharing a little bit about the importance of building those relationships, and really that's how we need to access information through those relationships with others. Do you have any advice for non-Indigenous RECEs in beginning that journey of making connections within the community, and really where to begin? I think that might be something people struggle with, is really where to begin with access.
Okay. Well, first and foremost, I think where a lot of people need to start is just in developing that understanding about history, about the true history. So if you're looking for information about that, you can look to like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, which has calls to action, which actually gives some guidelines as to how we can begin the process of reconciliation. If you're not using the language of reconciliation, if you're not in that place of being ready to reconcile, it probably means that you are needing to learn more in order to get to that place. So that history that was kept from most of us, I remember I wasn't taught anything about residential schools when I was a student in elementary school or high school or beyond. So if you've lived your whole life without knowing anything about the Indian residential schools, it's that what they were called, the Indian Act, which is still what it's called legally, that it has that name, and we have legally binding use of those words when we're talking about status Indian and non-status Indian. It's the 60s scoop, which has actually become more of a millennial scoop, where we see there are more Indigenous children in the child welfare system than ever before, and it's rather alarming. But this is this ongoing colonial practices that continue to seep into our everyday. And so you need to really have a deep understanding of what those practices are and how they impact, because I think what happens sometimes is we're so eager to jump into those relationships, but then we can't have a conversation and be talking about the same thing because we don't actually know really important things about maybe this family's history, that and I think something a lot of people have heard about this idea of intergenerational trauma, right? That the traumas experienced in residential schools have impacted for generations. Well, in my teachings, we, for centuries, for thousands of years, we have known that what happens to you in your lifetime, what's in your environment and the experiences that you have, they can have an impact 7 generations down the line, right? 7 generations from now, those children are going to experience some kind of negative impact from the experiences that you had. This was a teaching that was just kind of, well, we know this. But now there's an entire body of science dedicated to this epigenetics that shows that what happens genetically impacts, and yeah, it turns out 7 generations down the line. So if any Indigenous person says that they haven't been impacted by intergenerational trauma. They're not understanding the impacts of Indigenous repression and genocide. Every single person who has even a single drop of Indigenous blood is susceptible to that intergenerational trauma, because every single Indigenous person in North America was impacted by colonialism. So even just knowing that, even if I didn't have a parent who was in residential school, but my great-grandparents were, you're still going to feel the impacts of that in some way or another because of epigenetics. So in getting back to how do you broach those conversations, again, making sure that you have a good sense of the true history before you try to reconcile, because if you're having a conversation with somebody and you don't know your stuff, you might further alienate children or families just by showing that you don't really know what happened to their family. So again, if you're looking for where to start, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has these calls to action. And there's actually just yesterday, I think, the AECEO released their ECE Link magazine that is focused on Indigenous pedagogies and perspectives, and it had some really poignant pieces in there. So if you get a chance, have a look at those, read, because they're based on the perspectives of some of the Indigenous educators in our province who are working with these pedagogies and who are addressing some of these issues every single day when they're working with the children in their programs. And that's the other thing, is that other educators can be a source, right? So maybe you don't know any Indigenous people, and maybe you don't think you know, because not everybody identifies. I know I didn't come out, so to speak, until I was in my 20s because of the discrimination I faced when I was a child, right? So because I'm of mixed descent, a lot of people just assumed that I was Caucasian, and so I was able to choose not to identify in schools because I had experienced some really horrible racism when I was young, and just said, well, you know what, I'm never going to, hearing my own teacher refer to my ancestors as savages shut me down for a good 20 years. So it's very personal to actually talk about being Indigenous. If you think about how it was a point of shame for so many people for so long, because the government wanted us, the Canadian government was very active in trying to bring all of the Indigenous people into the fold and have them take on that role of being the good Canadian with the Canadian values and languages, and that the culture piece was supposed to die out. And we are definitely resilient. We are nothing if not resilient. So if it's okay, I'd like to put it out there that we have Indigenous educators working around the province who are just a wealth of knowledge themselves, and engaging in reflective dialogue with these educators, finding and seeking opportunities to have conversations with people, to gain those understandings and to ask those questions in a safe space. I think that would be that would certainly be very valuable. Do we have any other?
Absolutely. No, those. Yeah, it does look like there are a few other questions, Amber, but I just wanted to thank you for your response. That was very thoughtful, and I think pointing people to that place of reconciliation and information and learning and history is it sounds like a fabulous place to start. There are some specific questions for you that I'd just like to bring out, but there is quite a back and forth in our chat where lots have actually responded to others, so that's really nice to see. Some specific questions around June 21st. There was two there, but really specifically, wanting to know how to incorporate and approach that day, if there's any thoughts around that particular day, as well as some questions. We'll start with that and then see what else comes through through the chat box.
Okay. It's It's a great question, and there's no easy answer. But what I can say is it's important not to rush, right? Not to do something celebratory just on the face of, wanting it to look like you're supportive of Indigenous pedagogies and families and experiences, and that you're welcoming to those communities. The reason being, and I've been witness to one of these before, where the educator wanted to kind of cover all the bases and give teachings and share information about Métis, Inuit, and First Nations, but it was very overgeneralized. It was very, it kind of lumped all Indigenous people into one group, and that sends the wrong message. It sends the wrong message to non-Indigenous people who are wanting to learn more, and it certainly sends the wrong message to Indigenous people. You think about a child who has, their own identity about who they are within their own cultural and familial contexts, and then they hear their educator or an educator that they know saying, this is the belief of First Nations people, this is the belief of Inuit people, this is the belief of Métis, and that there is no single person on earth who knows all there is to know about all of those groups. It would be like, I like to use this example because I lived in Ireland for a time. It would be like me saying, asking this man from Cork in Ireland, the southern part of Ireland, to teach me about European culture. Now, he might be able to teach me something about Irish culture, but more readily he'd be able to teach me about the culture in Cork, and even more readily than that, the culture within his family, right? Contextually speaking, he's probably could tell me all kinds of things about what it's like to be an Irish person living in Cork, but to expect him to give me teachings about what it means to be European or to share European traditions is so broad and so general that it actually does such a disservice to the rich diversity that exists within Europe. It's the same with Indigenous communities. There's nobody that can you can't say or pretend to know enough to say blanket statement, this is what we believe in, because that's not going to be the case. There's lots of similarities within the different cultures, of course, but there's nothing that's across the board the same with every culture there is, and nor could there be. And even within Anishinaabe culture, there are different dialects, there are different stories and traditions, because, again, our tendency was to not overwhelm the lands we were living on. So when our communities got too big, we would split up and form smaller communities, and in those communities. So as we spread out, our languages changed a little bit, our experiences changed, our stories changed, and our teaching changes. So you can't say, here we're going to teach you about, and it's not National Aboriginal Day, it's, I'm trying to remember because they changed it last year. But for some Indigenous people, it's not celebrated, because it's, again, it's very heavy with this ongoing assimilation practices, right? So some Indigenous people don't even like to celebrate it. They don't recognize June 21st. And some people do. Some people think it's wonderful that we have this day that we're recognized. So again, you have to know those relationships with the children and the families in your program. And to say, well, you know what, we're just going to celebrate this day without having that background, without having that experience, can come off as being rather superficial. It would be the same as if, I think if you decided that you were going to celebrate any culture, like Chinese New Year, for example, having not much information about it, but just knowing that there might be some Chinese children in your program, going ahead and doing a celebration without actually having a conversation with that family is again, you're glossing over the relationship piece, and that piece is so important. National Indigenous Persons Day. Thank you. So you have to be really careful with that day because it is loaded. It is absolutely loaded. For some people it's a good thing, for some people it's not, but you really have to start with those relationships. And if you don't know of any Indigenous children in your program, making a big deal of that day, making it a huge event, might not be the way to go, because just because you don't know of Indigenous children in your program doesn't mean they're not there. Like I said, a lot of people don't identify because it's safe not to. So, and the other thing I should mention too is that June 21st is a special date for a lot of us Indigenous people because it's the solstice, right? So we wouldn't be celebrating a holiday that the Canadian government deemed a holiday. We would be celebrating culturally the longest day of the year, the beautiful summer weather. We would be out on the land. We would be celebrating with the relationships that we have with our animal spirits and plant spirits and the elements, and because everything is our relation, right? Everything is related to us, and we are related to everything. We are reliant on everything, and therefore those relationships are the key. So if you're looking for a good way to celebrate National Aboriginal Day, or sorry, National Indigenous Persons Day, go outside and explore the land, create opportunities for children to establish relationships with the natural world, because that ecological identity, that is going to be supportive of every child, no matter what their background or culture or language or experience is. Living out in the land, being engaged with the land is universal. So you really can't go wrong with that.